Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today, we're embarking on a journey to one of humanity's most compelling and often misunderstood stories,
Yeah.
Easter Island, known to its inhabitants as Rapa Nui.
hmm
For decades, the prevailing narrative around this isolated Pacific gem has been a pretty stark cautionary tale. Suppose an environmental collapse, a society that tragically destroyed itself through unsustainable practices. It's been held up as this dire warning for our own planet.
Yeah, that's the story most people know.
But as we're about to discover, that story might be far from complete. Okay, let's unpack this fascinating puzzle.
What's truly fascinating here is that we're going to fundamentally challenge this deeply entrenched ecocide narrative.
Right.
New data emerging from the forefront of advanced scientific techniques and meticulous reevaluations of historical evidence are now painting a much more nuanced and, frankly, a far more inspiring picture of the Rapa Nui people's interaction with their environment.
More inspiring. How so?
Well, it turns out their story seems to be one of incredible resilience and adaptation rather than just self-inflicted demise.
And that's exactly why we're here. The traditional narrative leaves so many persistent questions, doesn't it?
It really does.
For instance, what was the true extent of deforestation on the island? When exactly did human settlement occur, and how does that timeline truly align with the environmental changes we see?
And what were the real underlying causes of the societal shifts observed on Rapa Nui? Those are the big questions.
Exactly. So to answer these, we'll be sifting through a treasure trove of fascinating data from diverse fields, from the microscopic insights of paleoecology and the precise measurements of genetics, to the broad contextual understanding offered by anthropology.
It's a real interdisciplinary effort.
Our mission in this deep dive is to equip you, our dedicated history enthusiast listener, with the most current, detailed, and balanced understanding of Rapa Nui. Prepare for surprising facts and those incredible aha moments that will leave you desiring a truly complete solution to the Rapa Nui mystery. You'll gain a quick, yet exceptionally thorough understanding of some of the most complex historical and environmental debates out there. Okay, so to truly understand Rapa Nui's environmental past, we need to stretch our imaginations way, way back in time.
Much further back.
It isn't just about human arrival. It requires us to look back hundreds of thousands of years, long before the first canoes ever touched its shores. The island's deep geological timeline is critical context here.
Precisely. And to truly grasp these long-term environmental patterns, we can draw a crucial comparative context from places like Lake Ohrid in southeastern Europe.
Lake Ohrid, why there?
Well, Lake Ohrid offers one of the deepest and most continuous pollen records. That's fossil pollen, tiny grains preserved in sediments that tell us about past vegetation known to science.
Wow.
This record spans the last 500,000 years, 500,000 years BP, giving us an incredible archive of how vegetation and climate naturally changed over vast periods, long before any significant human influence anywhere nearby.
500,000 years.
Yeah.
That's incredible context.
It really is. And what this record consistently shows is that Earth's climate naturally fluctuates dramatically. During glacial periods, the ice ages, Lake Ohrid was characterized by vast grasslands dominated by plants like grasses, Chenopodiaceae, and Artemisia.
So cold and grassy.
Right. Conversely, interglacial periods, the warmer times between ice ages, saw widespread woodland expansion. You get trees like firs, spruces, and various oak types taking hold.
A completely different landscape.
Completely. And it's particularly significant that the Lake Ohrid region is identified as a plant refugium. That means tree species continuously persisted there even during the harshest glacial phases. It shows the resilience of life through these massive natural climate shifts.
Okay.
So this broad stroke of natural climate and vegetation changes from Lake Ohrid provides essential context for understanding what might have transpired on Easter Island. It shows that landscapes naturally undergo immense transformations over geological timescales, completely independent of humans.
That's an incredible sweep of history, showing just how dynamic Earth's ecosystems are on a grand scale, shaped by cycles far beyond human influence. Now, bringing our focus back to Easter Island itself, what's truly exciting is how modern scientific methods are allowing us to pinpoint environmental shifts on the island that occurred much, much earlier than previously believed.
Yes, long before the classic ecocide narrative even begins.
So what are we finding?
Indeed. What our sources reveal is groundbreaking new paleontological evidence, that's the study of fossil pollen and spores again, from the Lake Raraku crater on Easter Island.
Right, one of the main crater lakes.
Exactly. This evidence suggests that a mire environment, a type of wetland, began forming at the bottom of the Lake Rauku crater, initially surrounded by a lush, palm-dominated wooded landscape. But here's the kicker. This new data indicates significant human disturbance and potential settlement around 450 BC.
450 BC. That's way earlier than I thought.
It is. It falls within a calibrated range of roughly 790 BC to 90 BC. And this is approximately 1,500 years earlier than the commonly accepted dates for human arrival and widespread landscape change, which typically range from AD 800 to 1200.
1,500 years earlier. Wow. What are the signs?
The markers for this early human presence are quite clear in the pollen record. This date, 450 BC, is identified by the first significant vegetation change. We see a noticeable decline in palm pollen, coupled with an increase in herbaceous plants, things like grasses, a plant called Verbena littoralis, and Solanum sp.
Okay, so fewer trees, more weedy plants.
Exactly. And what's particularly compelling is that Verbena littoralis is a weed known to be associated with human-disturbed sites. And get this, it's also of American origin.
American origin.
Yeah. Which hints at some surprising early trans-Pacific connections we'll definitely discuss later. Alongside these vegetation shifts, there's a slight but distinct increase in charcoal influx, tiny bits of charcoal in the sediment, which strongly supports early human presence and the initial opening up of the landscape, likely through small-scale burning.
So we need to picture early Easter Island not as this pristine, untouched paradise that was suddenly destroyed, but maybe as a vibrant, lush green canvas upon which the first subtle brushstrokes of human presence began to appear much, much earlier than we ever thought.
That's a great way to put it. A very different starting point for the story.
That earlier timeline completely reframes our understanding, doesn't it? It just shifts everything.
It really does.
And it brings us to another critical debate. What was the original nature and true extent of Easter Island's forests? Was it a completely forested island, like a dense jungle from coast to coast? Or was it perhaps a more varied landscape, a mosaic of different vegetation types?
Yeah, this is where the core of the ecocide debate really got its start. The traditional interpretation, largely based on those pioneering pollen analyses of lake sediment cores by researchers like Flenley and King back in the 1980s.
Right, few early studies.
Presented a seemingly clear picture. Their study showed a distinct and, well, rather dramatic replacement of palm-dominated pollen by grass-dominated ones in the island's sediment records.
So palms out, grass in.
Yeah.
Seems straightforward.
Exactly. And this was widely interpreted as clear evidence of island-wide deforestation, a direct result of extensive land clearing by the indigenous Rapa Nui people. This interpretation formed the bedrock of the narrative that the island was once entirely covered by forest.
But that's being challenged now.
Very much so. Recent scholarship offers a compelling alternative view. Palynological and anthracological, that's the study of charcoal fragments, results are now suggesting that the evidence is actually compatible with a mosaic vegetation pattern.
A mosaic, meaning patches of forest and open areas.
Precisely. In this scenario, dense forests might have been restricted to specific environmentally favorable areas, particularly those with high freshwater tables. Think of them as gallery forests, thriving around the permanent lakes within the volcanic craters like Rano Araku and Rano Kau.
Okay, where the water collects.
And also possibly along the coast where groundwater might have been more accessible. These craters, Rano Araku and Rano Kau, are crucial because they hold permanent lakes fed solely by precipitation. They're hydrologically disconnected from the island's main groundwater system.
So they create their own little microclimates.
Exactly. This unique hydrological setup would have naturally favored humid microclimates, ideal for the development of these gallery forests, even if other parts of the island were drier or more open.
Interesting. What about other areas?
Well, it's important to note the contrast with other areas like Rano Arroy, another crater. The pollen diagram from Rano Arroy, for example, is largely dominated by poaceae. That's grasses and shows very low percentages of palms.
Very different from Raku and Kau, then.
Completely different. This strongly suggests that Rano Arroy was a fundamentally different environment from the start, perhaps a higher elevation shrub community or maybe intermittent herbaceous marshes. This directly challenges the earlier tree line hypothesis that suggested continuous palm forests existed up to a certain elevation.
So instead of a uniform, dense forest being wiped out.
We're now looking at a more complex, varied ecological tapestry from the beginning.
That paints a much more intricate picture. And it leads to an intriguing question about those dominant palm species. What kind of magnificent trees actually populated this ancient landscape? We hear palm forest, but what kind of palm?
That's a key piece of the puzzle, and unfortunately, the precise identity of the dominant palms remains unknown because they appear to have gone extinct.
Oh, completely gone.
Seems so. Several candidates have been proposed over the years. One suggestion was jubea, a palm found in Chile. But there are significant environmental differences between mainland Chile and Easter Island that make that analogy a bit difficult.
Right, different conditions.
Another proposed candidate is Juania australis, a palm from the Juan Fernandez Islands, which are also off the coast of Chile, based more on morphological similarity. However, a specific genus, Postulococos, was actually defined based on the morphology of nut fragments or subfossil endocarps that have been discovered right there on the island.
So nuts preserved from the extinct palm.
Exactly. These nut fragments, which are crucial for this identification, also show evident signs of rat gnawing. We'll definitely come back to the rats later. And they've been dated to a wide range between about 800 radiocarbon years before present, so around AD 1200 up to about AD 1680.
So we know a palm existed, maybe even named it Postulococos, but its exact botanical family tree is still a bit of a mystery.
That's the current state of play, yes. It adds to the enigma.
And speaking of things complicating the picture, you mentioned these gaps in the sediment records earlier.
Yes, sedimentary hiatuses. This brings us to another significant challenge in reconstructing Easter Island's paleoenvironment. These are essentially gaps in the geological record within sediment cores. They represent periods where either no sediment was deposited or existing sediment was somehow eroded away.
So missing pages in the environmental history book.
A perfect analogy. Earlier research on cores, for instance, from Rana Raraku, showed very long gaps, sometimes spanning thousands of years, like one between 7,000 and 500 radiocarbon years before present. That made it incredibly difficult to get a continuous record of environmental change.
Plenty of gap.
Huge. However, newer studies, utilizing improved chronological frameworks and more advanced coring techniques, are identifying shorter, more nuanced gaps. And crucially, these hiatuses are often now being linked to dry climatic phases rather than being solely attributed to human destruction.
Ah, so climate, not just people, causing the gaps.
It seems increasingly likely. For example, a sedimentary hiatus identified in Lake Raraku from approximately 8500 to 1165 is potentially related to drought phases during the medieval climate anomaly, a known period of climatic fluctuation in many parts of the world.
Okay.
And another hiatus from about 1570 to 1720 could be linked to drought events during the Little Ice Age. These periods of non-deposition or erosion mean that key information about environmental shifts is, quite literally, hidden from our direct view in the sediment record, complicating any straightforward interpretation of, say, a sudden collapse.
Okay, so we've got a potentially much earlier human arrival, a more complex mosaic environment, an extinct mystery palm, and natural climate shifts causing gaps in the record. That's already a fascinating and complex picture of the island's natural history.
It is, isn't it? Much more involved than the simple story.
But now, let's pivot to the elephant in the room, the narrative that has truly captured the public imagination. The widely popularized ecocide theory, especially championed by figures like Jared Diamond. What exactly did this theory claim happened on Easter Island?
Right. The traditional ecocide view, as put forth by Diamond and others, painted a very grim picture indeed. It asserted that the Rapa Nui population grew unsustainably, potentially reaching over 15,000 individuals. Some estimates were even higher.
A huge number for such a small, isolated island.
Exactly. And this rapid growth, the theory goes, led directly to the complete deforestation of the island by the 1600s. The blame was placed squarely on the islanders' intensive use of wood, not just for firewood and general agricultural clearing, but crucially for the transportation of those massive moai statues.
The idea they needed logs to roll the statues.
Precisely. This unsustainable exploitation, so the theory claimed, culminated in a catastrophic societal collapse before any significant European contact, which began in 1722 AD. This collapse was supposedly characterized by severe resource scarcity, widespread famine, violent warfare, and even acts of cannibalism.
It's a very dramatic, very dark story.
Extremely. To quote Diamond himself from his book Collapse, "In just a few centuries, the people of Easter Island wiped out their forests, drove their plants and animals to extinction, and saw their complex society spiral into chaos and cannibalism."
Wow.
This traditional view is reiterated in many popular accounts. There's one from Manga Bay, for instance, which describes the island as a barren landscape when the first Europeans arrived in 1722. Its inhabitants thin and emaciated, lacking seaworthy boats, leaving the Europeans mystified by the presence of the great stone statues in the supposedly ruined landscape.
Right.
This narrative, with its dramatic arc of environmental destruction and societal self-implosion, has resonated deeply as a cautionary tale for modern society. Don't let this happen to us.
And this is precisely where the story takes a remarkable turn, because a powerful counter-narrative has emerged in recent scholarship, fundamentally challenging those long-held assumptions. Here's where it gets really interesting.
That's right. Recent research is increasingly, and I'd say quite strongly, refuting the idea of a pre-European contact societal collapse, specifically because of ecocide.
So, no collapse before 1722.
The evidence points away from it. While deforestation undoubtedly occurred on Rapa Nui, that's not really in dispute. The new evidence suggests that the Rapa Nui people were far from passive victims. They actively adapted to these environmental changes.
Adaptation, not collapse.
Exactly. And crucially, any significant population decline, and there definitely was one eventually, is now understood primarily as a direct consequence of European contact.
Diseases.
Primarily, yes. Devastating Old World diseases introduced after 1722, which the islanders had no immunity to, not from a collapse preceding European arrival. To quote a University of Copenhagen study on ancient Rapa Nui DNA, there is no evidence of a population collapse before the Europeans arrived on the island, so we can put those ideas to rest now.
That's pretty definitive.
It's strong language, yes. Similarly, the Triumph of the Commons research, which we'll touch on more, highlights, while long seen as a potential warning for the future, a range of interdisciplinary research conducted over the last case. 20 years now clearly shows that Rapa Nui communities were resilient and sustainable. This represents a profound shift in understanding.
It's incredible how a story can become so ingrained, even when evidence points elsewhere. So why does the collapsed myth, this captivating yet potentially misleading story, hold such sway? Why is it so sticky in our collective consciousness?
Well, Carl Lipo, a professor of anthropology who's done a lot of work on Rapa Nui, offers a compelling perspective on this.
Okay.
He explains that the concept linking environmental change directly to human populations really gained traction back in the 1960s. Over time, this focus intensified, with many researchers coming to view environmental changes as a primary, almost deterministic driver of cultural shifts and transformations.
So environment dictates culture.
That became a very strong framework. Lipo suggests that this strong correlation and the subsequent collapse narrative specifically for Easter Island may actually stem more from our modern concerns, our anxieties about industrialization-driven pollution, resource depletion, global climate change, rather than being solely based on direct, incontrovertible archaeological evidence from the island itself.
So we're projecting our fears onto the past.
That's the argument. He points out that environmental changes occur on different scales and in varying magnitudes, and human communities respond to these changes in diverse ways. They often demonstrate remarkable resilience and sustainability, which gets overlooked if you're only looking for collapse.
Right.
For you, the listener, this is a crucial point. It encourages you to question assumptions and appreciate the inherent complexity of historical interpretation. It's a reminder that sometimes our own contemporary concerns can inadvertently shape how we interpret the past, maybe leading us to see catastrophe where there was actually adaptation.
That deep dive into the contested history of the ecocide narrative really challenges what many of us thought we knew. It's quite a shift. So if the ecocide narrative is being challenged, what does the evidence say about how the Rapa Nui people managed to thrive for centuries on such an isolated island? How did they adapt?
It's a remarkable story of ingenuity and adaptation, really. The Rapa Nui developed highly effective agricultural practices. One of their most significant innovations was the development of extensive lithic mulch gardens.
Lithic mulch. Stone mulch.
Exactly. This involved placing stones, often volcanic rocks, scattered across the landscape around their crops. It sounds simple, but it proved incredibly effective in improving soil productivity, even on the island's naturally nutrient-poor volcanic soils.
How did the stones help?
In several ways. The stones helped retain crucial moisture in the soil by reducing evaporation. They protected vulnerable seedlings from the strong island winds and buffered soil temperatures, actually warming the soil slightly, which could extend the growing season. They also slowly released nutrients as they weathered.
Wow, that's clever. Multi-purpose.
Very clever. And this agricultural innovation is a direct counterpoint to the collapse claims. While deforestation was indeed associated with agricultural clearing, and there was some localized soil erosion, Island-wide studies show that only about 5% of the land surface exhibits severe erosion, and crucially, much of that erosion is actually attributed to post-contact sheep ranching introduced much later, not to pre-European Rapa Nui practices.
So the landscape wasn't totally destroyed by their farming.
The evidence suggests not on a catastrophic scale, no. Furthermore, it's important to clarify certain assumptions about resource use. Palm trees, for instance, despite their eventual decline, were likely not a critical dietary source for the Rapa Nui. Their nuts might have been eaten, but probably weren't a staple.
Okay.
Nor were the palm trees, as we'll discuss later, likely viable for constructing large seaworthy canoes. This means their loss, while significant ecologically, didn't necessarily cause the kind of major dietary or economic stress imagined in the collapse narrative, especially since introduced chickens became an important and sustainable protein source for the islanders.
Right, they had chickens. So they adapted their diet too.
They did. And to understand how Rapa Nui society managed all this, we can look to the work of Elinor Ostrom. She was a Nobel Prize-winning economist whose research provides a powerful framework for understanding how communities can sustainably manage shared resources, what she termed common pool resources, without necessarily needing top-down government regulation or complete privatization.
Okay, how does that apply here?
Ostrom's work demonstrated that successful self-governance of shared resources often adheres to several key core design principles. These principles reveal a flexible yet robust governance structure that allows communities to avoid the tragedy of the commons, that scenario where everyone overexploits a shared resource until it's gone.
Right, the classic problem. So what are these principles?
Let's quickly outline Ostrom's core design principles, because they're fundamental to understanding how the Rapa Nui likely operated successfully for so long. First, there must be clearly defined boundaries, who is part of the group, and what exactly is the shared resource.
Okay, clear membership and resource definition.
Second, the rules regarding appropriation and provision of common resources should match local needs and conditions. Individuals should receive benefits proportionate to their contributions, perhaps ensuring that status is earned through participation.
Fair rules, benefits match effort. Got it.
Third, most individuals affected by the operational rules can participate in modifying them, decisions made by consensus or through collective choice arrangements, fostering broad buy-in.
People have a say in the rules.
Fourth, effective monitoring is crucial. Monitors, who are accountable to the users, or are the users themselves, actively audit resource conditions and user behavior to deter free riding or rule breaking.
Keeping an eye on things.
Fifth, a scale of graduated sanctions for rule violators. Punishment starts mild and increases for repeat offenses, allowing for correction rather than immediate, harsh exclusion.
Fair consequences.
Sixth, accessible, low-cost means for dispute resolution. Fair and collectively agreed-upon conflict resolution mechanisms are essential.
Easy ways to sort out disagreements.
Seventh, self-determination of the community recognized by higher-level authorities. Groups should be relatively autonomous, capable of conducting their own affairs without constant external interference.
Freedom to manage locally.
And finally, for common pool resources that are part of larger systems, appropriation, provision, monitoring, enforcement, conflict resolution, and governance activities are organized in multiple layers of nested enterprises. For larger-scale interactions, appropriate coordination among subgroups is necessary.
So systems work together at different scales.
Exactly. These principles, when present, create a robust governance structure that allows communities to manage shared resources effectively and foster truly sustainable communities, rather than falling into that tragedy of the commons trap.
It's fascinating how those principles provide a lens through which to view Rapa Nui. Connecting this framework to the archaeological and ethnohistoric evidence, does it fit? Does it suggest the Rapa Nui communities exhibited these very principles?
It strongly suggests they did. The archaeological record on Rapa Nui points to the existence of a series of semi-autonomous communities distributed across the island, each likely managing their local affairs and resources.
Okay, distinct groups.
This is further supported by ethnohistoric accounts from 18th and 19th century European visitors. For instance, the French explorer La Perouse, visiting in 1786, observed that villages were consistently built near the ahu, those ceremonial platforms with the moai. This observation suggests a clear division of the island into districts, each possibly associated with an ahu and having its own local management structure.
So local control over farms, fishing spots.
Exactly. While agricultural land, marine foraging areas, and freshwater sources were likely managed at these localized community scales, certain resources were undeniably common pool resources requiring larger-scale coordination.
Like the quarries for the statues.
Precisely. The lithic quarries, particularly Ranararaku for the volcanic tuff used for the moai bodies and Punapau for the red scoria pukau or hats, are prime examples. These were essential resources for the entire island's monumental construction efforts.
So how did they manage those? Was there conflict?
Interestingly, there is no archaeological evidence of walls, barriers, or other obvious restrictions that would have prevented access to these crucial sources. Instead, what researchers find are distinct quarrying areas within Ranararaku, suggesting that different groups or lineages worked contemporaneously, perhaps in designated zones. This implies some form of larger social organization and coordination for their use, ensuring access without necessarily leading to conflict.
So cooperation rather than competition for the quarries.
The evidence leans that way. This collective management, without clear signs of widespread conflict over these shared resources, aligns remarkably well with Ostrom's principles and speaks volumes about the Rapa Nui's sophisticated ability to self-govern and sustain their monumental culture for centuries. It wasn't chaos, it was organized. Micro-recap break.
Okay, let's just pause for a moment and recap where we are. We've challenged the classic ecocide narrative, pushed back the timeline for human arrival significantly, explored the idea of a mosaic environment rather than total forest cover, and seen strong evidence for Rapa Nui resilience through agricultural innovation, like lithic mulching and sophisticated social organization, possibly reflecting Ostrom's principles for managing common resources.
That's a good summary. We've moved from a story of self-destruction to one of adaptation and sustainable practices, at least until European contact changed everything.
Right. It really makes you look back at the original theory and derive a very different conclusion from the same island, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The data forces a reevaluation.
Okay, so that notion of resilience and sustainable resource management on Rapa Nui is powerful. But you mentioned it isn't just unique to them, right? It's part of a broader, incredible story across the Pacific. This is where we see how the Rapa Nui story of adaptation isn't isolated, but part of a wider pattern of traditional ecological knowledge, tech, and conservation practices found throughout Polynesia and the wider Pacific. Here's where it gets really interesting.
That's absolutely right. These practices are deeply embedded in many Pacific cultures. One powerful example comes from French Polynesia, the concept of rahui.
Rahui, what is that exactly?
Rahui is a traditional form of tapu, which you might know as taboo, but it's more like a sacred restriction. It's applied to specific resources like a fishing ground or a type of fruit or entire territories, and it was often imposed by chiefs or community leaders to manage those resources and ensure their sustainability, like putting a temporary ban on harvesting something to let it recover.
So a traditional conservation tool.
Precisely. And it's not just historical. The Rahui Forum and Research Center actively works today to empower local communities in French Polynesia to manage their natural resources by coupling these traditional participatory management strategies with contemporary ecological tools and scientific monitoring.
Merging old wisdom and new science.
Exactly. Their aims are comprehensive. They document and preserve traditional knowledge. They measure anthropogenic, that is, human-caused impacts on the environment. They model the potential effectiveness of different Rahui management scenarios, and they facilitate workshops and training sessions for local resource managers.
That sounds really effective.
It is, and it's particularly insightful that they emphasize the importance of linguistic precision in Tahitian. They note that words like mana, which is sort of spiritual power or authority derived from divine influence, tapu, the state where mana is present, making something sacred or restricted, and rahui itself are deeply tied to cultural identity and history. Using these terms carefully and correctly is critical in these conservation efforts because the concepts themselves hold power.
Wow, the language itself is part of the conservation.
In a very real sense, yes. Another compelling illustration of traditional conservation practices comes from Fiji, specifically through the community of Nassau Village.
Okay, Fiji. What's happening in Nassau?
Nassau is quite unique because it's one of only 3 villages in its province that can only be accessed by boat. The villagers have made a conscious choice to keep the Lulu mountain range and its forest intact. They rely on boat access rather than cutting a road through the mountain, even though a road might be more convenient.
Why did they make that choice?
It directly reflects their commitment to avoid destroying the vibrant ecosystem and their livelihood, which depends on that healthy environment. It emphasizes their deep understanding of the interconnectedness between the forest, the rivers, the coast, and their well-being.
That's a powerful statement.
It really is. And within NASA, we find specific practices rooted in this understanding. For example, they use the Kora ni Sigani Voivoi, which translates to the cave for sunning pandanus leaves.
The cave for drying leaves.
Yes, pandanus leaves are essential for weaving traditional mats and handicrafts. Drying them properly is crucial but laborious. This specific cave is utilized during a particular time of year, from June to September, when the sun's effect on the cave's rock surface is optimal for drying.
How does it work?
It simplifies the process enormously. Women don't need to boil the leaves for half a day or constantly turn them out in the sun for weeks. They simply place the harvested pandanus leaves inside the cave, weighted down by a stone, and the natural heat and airflow in the cave does the work.
Incredible. Nature providing the technology.
Exactly. And the commitment to this traditional method is strong. Bu Bao, a 68-year-old woman from the village, exemplifies this wisdom. When asked if she'd prefer a modern artificial dryer for convenience, she responded with a resounding no.
Really? Why not?
She explained, "True, it will be easier, but it will cause chaos and too much rubbish. Also, if it goes bad, meaning the dryer breaks, we return to the caves, so better off without it. This is free, no trouble." Her words, though seemingly simple, articulate a profound natural conservation method and a deep-seated preference for sustainable, time-tested practices over modern, potentially disruptive and wasteful alternatives.
Free, no trouble. That says a lot about sustainability.
It really does. The village also preserves other traditional knowledge, like using the force of a waterfall for a natural massage when tired from planting in their gardens. It reflects responsible land use and respect for ancestral wisdom. And their conservation efforts extend beyond the village itself. Since 2007, the villagers have dedicated nearby Vatu Aira Island as a bird sanctuary, now officially known as Vatu Aira Conservation Park.
A whole island sanctuary.
Yes, managed by the villagers in partnership with organizations like the Wildlife Conservation Society and BirdLife International. This effort protects the permanent home of 9 species of breeding seabirds, including red-footed and brown boobies, black noddies, lesser frigate birds, and various terns. It's a thriving ecosystem thanks to their stewardship.
That's fantastic. Are there challenges?
Oh, yes. Despite these efforts, challenges persist, particularly illegal fishing in their traditional fishing grounds, Kola Koli, and trespassing on the sanctuary island, sometimes by people trying to collect guano bird droppings used as fertilizer. The villagers actively patrol against these threats.
It requires constant vigilance.
It does, and this commitment stems from the deep Fijian connection to land, which is embedded in their identity. When a Fijian introduces themselves, they can often share their totem, an animal, fruit, plant, or tree identified with their province. They are born into a matakali, or clan, which is traditionally given a kanakanaka, a feeding ground for planting and hunting, and a kolikoli, a fishing ground.
So responsibility is inherited.
Exactly. This fosters a profound sense of custodianship, emphasizing that the land and sea are communal resources, not to be owned individually, but to be protected for future generations, so they can enjoy the gifts of their forebears. These examples from Polynesia and Fiji beautifully illustrate that Rapa Nui resilience isn't an anomaly. It's part of a much wider Pacific tradition of sophisticated environmental understanding and sustainable living.
It's clear that Polynesian communities possess this incredibly deep-seated knowledge about their environments. This brings us to another fascinating aspect. How does Polynesian seafaring knowledge connect to their environmental observation and perhaps even early forms of climate forecasting?
That's another rich area of tech. Samoan traditional ecological knowledge of weather and climate offers a compelling insight here.
Okay, Samoa. How did they read the weather?
Samoans developed a unique seasonal calendar, which is predominantly based on their astute observations of local environmental changes, particularly the behavior of plants and animals, phenology, basically. This knowledge wasn't merely academic. Their communal and family social activities, like deciding when was best for hunting, fishing, planting, or even holding feasts, were directly driven by the seasonal calendar.
So nature's cues dictated their activities.
Precisely. For instance, their knowledge of cloud formation was remarkably sophisticated. They had specific names to distinguish different types: Apoa for layered clouds, Auholili for dark, threatening clouds, and Fulafau for stratocumulus clouds. These traditional classifications align remarkably well with Western scientific meteorological classifications.
That's impressive detail. What about wind?
Similarly, their understanding of wind types, or mataji, categorized by direction and intensity, was highly refined. They used terms like matu for north winds, which often signaled tempests or storms or life or westerly winds that were associated with clear, cool skies and calm seas. This detailed knowledge allowed them to make short-term forecasts.
Practical knowledge for seafarers and farmers.
Absolutely critical. There's even a Samoan proverb, ua afale aso, which literally means stormy, hurricane-force weather conditions today. Saying this served as an immediate signal for preparation, telling everyone to secure houses, bring in canoes, and get ready for severe weather. It highlights how their tech provided critical, actionable information for survival.
Direct and effective communication.
Very. However, it's worth noting an interesting distinction. While Samoan tech is deeply rooted in these meticulous local environmental changes and observations, broader regional meteorological features that we now understand drive Pacific climate, things like ENSSO, the El Niño Southern Oscillation, El Niño itself, La Niña, the South Pacific Convergence Zone, SPCZ, the Intertropical Convergence Zone, ITCZ, and the Interdecadal Pacific Oscillation, IPO. These large-scale patterns are not explicitly found within their traditional knowledge systems.
So it was very localized knowledge.
Exactly. It suggests a powerful, localized focus of their tech, perfectly adapted to their immediate island environment and its observable cues, rather than a global, overarching climate understanding like modern meteorology aims for. It's a testament to the practical, applied nature of their wisdom, honed over centuries of direct observation.
That deep insight into Samoan traditional ecological knowledge really shows how sophisticated and, as you said, localized these ancient wisdoms were.
Amazing stuff. Now, let's shift our attention back to Easter Island, and specifically to the earliest human presence there, because you mentioned new findings are actually rewriting the entire timeline of Polynesian settlement.
Yes, this is truly groundbreaking work, mainly from recent paleoecological studies. As we touched upon earlier, that new palynological evidence from Lake Karaku strongly suggests human disturbance and potential settlement starting around 450 BC.
Right, the 1,500-year jump earlier.
Exactly, which, just to reiterate, falls within the calibrated range of 790 BC to 90 BC. This pushes back those widely accepted dates for Polynesian arrival, typically pegged between 800 and 1200, by a millennium and a half.
That's a huge leap in our understanding of how long people were there.
It really is. And this significantly earlier date is supported by several lines of evidence in the sediment cores. That initial decline in palm pollen, the notable increase in herbaceous plants, and especially the appearance and spread of Verbena littoralis, the American weed.
The American weed, yes. It's specifically associated with human-disturbed sites.
Okay.
And its appearance around this much earlier time supports the idea of a low-impact human presence during an initial, very early settlement phase.
Okay, so people arrived much earlier, maybe in small numbers initially. But that leads us to another truly mind-boggling discovery you hinted at. Evidence of pre-European contact between Polynesians and indigenous Americans. So what does this all mean for our understanding of ancient trans-Pacific voyages? Were Polynesians reaching South America long before Columbus?
This is one of the most exciting recent developments. Based on ancient DNA analysis, genetic studies, specifically the analysis of genomes from 15 ancient Rapa Nui individuals who lived between roughly 1670 and 1950 AD.
Okay, relatively recent, but still predating extensive modern mixing.
Right. These studies revealed that about 10% of their gene pool has an indigenous American origin. That in itself is interesting, but here's the crucial part, the detail that truly reframes our understanding of global exploration. The way this indigenous American DNA is distributed within the Polynesian genetic background, the patterns of inheritance is entirely consistent with the contact event happening between the 13th and 15th centuries AD. That's the 1200s to the 1400s.
Which is definitively before European arrival on Easter Island in 1722.
Absolutely. This strongly suggests that Rapa Nui ancestors, or perhaps other related Polynesian groups, reached the Americas before Christopher Columbus. It implies far more formidable and extensive trans-Pacific voyages by Polynesians than previously established or widely accepted.
Wow. They made it to South America and back.
The genetic evidence points towards contact. Adding another layer to this is the consistent presence of Verbena littoralis, that American weed we keep mentioning, found in Easter Island sediments dating all the way back to 450 BC.
So the weed arrived even earlier than the genetic mixing event.
Apparently so, which further supports the idea of earlier human presence and, critically, reopens the debate about the possible role of Amerindians in the island's initial colonization, or perhaps suggests even earlier, unrecorded Polynesian voyages that might have brought American flora back long before the major admixture events seen in the later genomes.
So it raises an important question. Did Polynesians sail to South America and back, bringing goods, plants, and maybe even people? Or did indigenous Americans somehow make it all the way out to Rapa Nui?
That's the million-dollar question. The current genetic study actually suggests the former scenario that Polynesians reached the Americas and then returned, resulting in the admixture as the more likely explanation for the specific genetic patterns observed. But the early appearance of the weed keeps the door open for other possibilities or even earlier contacts.
It just blows the lid off the old isolation models.
Completely. On a separate but equally important note related to this genetic work, this recent research also holds profound significance for modern repatriation efforts.
How so?
By analyzing the DNA of ancient Rapa Nui individuals whose remains are currently held in museum collections around the world, the study definitively confirmed their Rapa Nui ancestry. This provides strong, fact-based scientific arguments to support the claims of the modern Rapa Nui community for the return of their ancestors' remains to the island. It's science supporting cultural heritage and justice.
That's a really powerful application of the research. Okay, we've got early settlement, trans-Pacific voyages. Incredible. Now let's turn our attention to the icons themselves, the moai statues. These massive stone figures define Easter Island visually and are often absolutely central to the collapse narrative, right? The idea that carving and moving them destroyed the island.
Yes, they are inextricably linked to that narrative.
But new research seems to be challenging the common perception that their construction inevitably led to environmental ruin.
Indeed. Just to set the scene, there are approximately 1,000 moai known across Rapa Nui. It's a phenomenal number. About 270 of these were successfully transported and erected on large megalithic ceremonial platforms known as ahu, which are primarily positioned along the island's coastline.
Like sentinels facing inland.
Mostly, yes. You can almost visualize them, like that powerful row of 15 moai at Ahu Tongariki standing sentinel along the coast. Then, a staggering 400 moai remain at Ranawaraku, the extinct volcano that served as the main quarry, where almost all of them were carved from the volcanic tuff.
Still in the factory.
Exactly, in various stages of completion.
Yeah.
Additionally, around 46 more statues can be found lying on what are known as statue roads, supposedly abandoned mid-transit between the quarry and their intended ahu.
Okay. And when were they doing all this?
The exact dating of when moai production began and when they were set up on ahu is still debated. Some evidence might push it back to the 8th century AD, possibly even earlier, but the main, most intensive phase of activity is traditionally placed between the 11th and 15th centuries AD, roughly AD 1000 to 1500.
A period of intense activity.
Very intense. And many statues are still deeply integrated within the Ranawaraku quarry itself. Some are still attached to the bedrock, literally mid-carving, while others stand upright but are partially or deeply buried in the quarry slopes. You can see images, like Figure 7 on one of the key sources, showing these statues within the quarry. It's quite evocative.
It's a powerful image, isn't it? Just frozen in time. But it brings us to that key tenet of the ecocide narrative.
Yeah.
The assumption that vast amounts of timber were required for moai transport, which then led directly to deforestation. Is that assumption still holding up under scrutiny?
Well, it's being seriously questioned. New analyses looking at the properties of the extinct palm wood and the engineering requirements are actually challenging the long-held belief that palm trees were essential or even suitable for moai transport.
Really? The log rolling idea might be wrong.
The studies indicate that the native palms, Pascalococos, were likely not robust enough, structurally strong enough to support the immense weight of the moai, especially over the long distances and uneven terrain required to move them from Ranawaraku to the coastal ahu.
Huh. So they might not have been cutting down palms for rollers after all.
It seems less likely than previously thought. This directly contradicts a core tenet of the ecocide narrative, which often cited the felling of trees for rollers and levers as a primary cause of deforestation and subsequent collapse. If palms weren't viable for transport or weren't the main method, then a major driver of the alleged ecocide is significantly weakened. They must have used other methods, perhaps walking the statues upright using ropes, as some researchers like Lipo and Hunt have demonstrated experimentally.
Okay, that's a major rethink. What about the quarrying itself? Where did the stone come from?
The Rapa Nui exploited two primary sources for their monumental stonework. Punapau, another smaller crater, was the source for the red scoria pukau. Those are the distinctive red hats, or top knots, that adorn some of the later, larger moai on the ahu. These pukau are often interpreted as indicators of high status or perhaps representing hair.
Right, the red top knots.
And then, of course, Rana Araku provided the softer volcanic tuff used to carve the moai bodies themselves. Researchers have done some really interesting work using geophysics at Punapau. They conducted a resistivity survey. It's a technique that's a bit like using electrical currents to see hidden structures beneath the ground, kind of like an X-ray.
Okay, looking underground, what do they find?
This survey, along with resistivity tomography, which creates detailed stratigraphic slices or images of the subsurface, clearly identified a buried, approximately 5-meter wide road exiting the Punapau crater.
A road specifically for the Pukao.
It appears so. It suggests a deliberate, structured, and likely long-lasting transport route, specifically for moving these multi-ton red scoria cylinders out of the quarry and towards the Ahu, where they'd be placed on the moai. It implies planning and organization, not a haphazard or desperate effort in a collapsing society. You can actually see diagrams like Figure 5 showing the survey setup and Figure 6 illustrating the tomography output, revealing these buried features.
Fascinating. And what about all those statues left in the Rana Araku quarry? The traditional view was they were abandoned due to crisis, right?
Yes, the traditional view attributes their abandonment to factors like intertribal feuds, resource crises stemming from deforestation, or the breakdown of the social order needed for such massive cooperative projects.
But there's an alternative.
There is. An alternative and increasingly accepted explanation suggests that many, perhaps even most, of these quarry statues were never actually intended to be removed or detached from their bedrock.
Never meant to leave the quarry.
Yeah.
Why?
Instead, they might have been purposeful embellishments of the quarry itself, conceived as an integral part of a sacred landscape. This theory is supported by a few key observations. Many of these quarry statues face outward from the slopes, toward the rest of the island and the sea, unlike the Ahu statues which face inland. And, critically, unlike those successfully erected on the Ahu, the quarry statues conspicuously lack carved eye sockets.
Ah, the eyes were only added once they reached the Ahu.
It seems so. This challenges the simplistic view of Rana Araku as merely a statue-producing factory, whose operations abruptly ceased at a gross moment of socio-economic crisis. Instead, it suggests a much more complex, perhaps ongoing, ritual significance for the quarry itself, with statues permanently embedded within it.
That's a profound reinterpretation. It suggests the quarries were not just industrial sites, but sacred spaces integrated into the Rapa Nui worldview. What about the work architecture of these quarries? Does their layout suggest anything about the social implications of their design? How were things organized?
That's a fascinating line of inquiry that researchers are actively pursuing. Preliminary surveys at Rana Araku have indeed prompted questions concerning the organization of work. They're trying to isolate discrete working areas within the quarries. Can we see where specific teams or lineages might have worked?
Like different workshops.
Potentially. Researchers are asking if different activity zones within the quarry were intervisible or interaudible. What were the social and perhaps ritual implications of such arrangements? The spatial positioning of the quarry spoil heaps, the routes into and out of the quarries, the specific working faces where statues were carved? All of these could potentially be understood as a form of deliberate work architecture, offering insights into the social meanings and roles of production, maybe reflecting clan structures or collaborative efforts.
And any clues about tools or methods?
Interestingly, preliminary work comparing Punapau, for the Pukao, and Rana Araku, for the moai, suggests the usage of different stoneworking tools. They found evidence of much thinner basalt axes, called toki, being used at Punapau compared to those typically found at Rana Araku. This might hint at diverse methods, maybe different techniques needed for the harder red scoria versus the softer tuff, or perhaps even specialized groups of carvers for each material.
Okay, moving beyond the quarries now, what about the Ahu landscapes themselves? You mentioned the statues faced inland. What else do we know about these ceremonial sites?
The Ahu landscapes reveal so much about Rapa Nui society and worldview. As you said, it's crucial to remember that moai placed on Ahu always had carved eye sockets. And we have archaeological evidence suggesting that at least some of these eye sockets were intended to hold inlaid eyes, typically made of white coral for the sclera, the white part, with striking red scoria pupils or irises.
Bringing the statues to life.
Exactly, giving them gaze. And crucially, these moai gazed inland over the community, not out to sea as is often mistakenly depicted. This raises immediate questions about what or who they were overseeing.
So what was inland?
Studies analyzing the placement of ahu show that they are recurrently situated in locations, often valleys or coastal plains, that have closed horizons from the perspective of the statue, meaning the statue primarily overlooked the adjacent ceremonial plaza, or marae, and the associated inland settlement features, rather than having a vast open view.
Okay, focused on the community space.
Precisely. These plazas were often clearly terraced and leveled, a significant landscaping effort that itself would have required considerable labor and likely involved tree clearance. And beyond the plaza were the settlement features, painting a vivid picture of Rapa Nui life clustered around these ceremonial centers.
Kind of features.
We find evidence of elite boat-shaped houses known as herpeanga, which had distinctive stone foundations. We find communal ovens, or umu. We see the extensive rock gardens, that lithic mulching system we talked about, showing intensive and sustainable agriculture right near the settlements. There are also stone chicken houses called hermoa and planting pits or stone-lined tree enclosures called manavai, likely used to protect vulnerable crops or saplings.
So a whole integrated complex of ceremony, housing, and agriculture.
Absolutely. While dating all these individual structures precisely is difficult, the overall picture by the later period of Ahu use is clearly one of cleared landscapes, intensely cultivated with these rock gardens supporting the communities living nearby. Interestingly, noise studies have been done, estimating sound propagation.
Noise study.
Yeah, researchers calculated how far sounds like human voices or construction activities, like stone hammering at the Ahu, would have carried. The results suggest these sounds likely wouldn't have penetrated much beyond the immediate plaza areas, indicating perhaps more localized activities or maybe a desire for acoustic separation between zones. Furthermore, the actual views from most Ahu platforms were somewhat limited. Ranararaku, the main quarry, was only directly visible from a very small number of Ahu located on the eastern part of the south coast, most dramatically from the massive Ahu Tongariki.
Interesting. What about the area behind the Ahu towards the sea?
The backspace of the coastal Ahu. This area often feels like a more private, perhaps even secret space. It's typically obscured from inland view by the platform's large back wall and usually features a narrow level area before a steep descent or cliff down to the sea. This back area is dominated by the sound of the ocean, a very different sensory experience from the inland-facing plaza.
And what happened there?
Archaeological evidence indicates this was where cremations took place. The Rapa Nui practiced cremation, and utilizing the strong sea winds in this location would have helped fuel the pyres and disperse the smoke and scent of burning bodies out over the ocean. Spatial studies even suggest that crematoria were often associated specifically with the west sides of the Ahu, hinting at a precise cosmological order or symbolism related to the setting sun for these mortuary elements.
Wow, a very structured approach to life and death.
Very. And the connections to the sea were profound and multi-layered. Ahu themselves appear specifically placed at bays, natural harbors, or access points to the sea. Many are physically connected to the ocean through features researchers are now identifying as recurrent canoe ramps, often carefully constructed using poro, those naturally rounded, interlocking beach boulders of pillow lava running down the sides or front of the Ahu towards the water.
Ramps for launching canoes near the sacred sites.
It seems highly likely. Even the Ahu platforms themselves are often elongated, sometimes described as canoe-shaped, and these symbolic land and sea references extended right into the domestic settlement features. The elite herpehenga houses were boat-shaped and sometimes had pavements made of sea poro. The unmu ovens often used poro stones, and even the walls of the manavai planting enclosures sometimes incorporated sea coral fragments or rocks covered with sea algae.
It's all interwoven land, sea, ancestors, community.
Exactly. Collectively, this detailed archaeological picture hints at a deeply symbolic and interconnected landscape, one that deliberately merged land and sea references. The moai on their Ahu were overseeing these thriving, organized, agriculturally productive communities, all deeply tied to the ocean. It's a picture of sophisticated integration and sustainability rather than a desolate, wasted land teetering on the edge of collapse.
It's a truly detailed and compelling picture of the Rapa Nui's monumental efforts and their organized society, really pushing back against the notion of collapse due to their own actions. It sounds like a functioning, complex society.
The archaeological picture certainly suggests that, yes.
But beyond human activity, let's now bring the focus back to something we touched on earlier. The often underestimated role of natural climate variability in shaping Easter Island's environmental history. How much did nature, rather than solely human actions, influence the significant changes observed on the island, like deforestation or changes in the lakes?
This is a critical point that the latest research highlights more and more. While human activities undoubtedly modified the landscape of Rapa Nui, clearing land for agriculture using wood resources, climate changes also played a very significant role. These natural changes often interacted with human activities, but sometimes they independently drove major ecological shifts on the island.
So it wasn't just one or the other, but an interplay.
Exactly, a complex interplay. We've already mentioned those sedimentary hiatuses, the gaps in the lake sediment records, new, improved chronological frameworks based on more numerous and precise dates, confirm that these gaps, like the ones found in Lake Araku, specifically the one from around 8500 to 80 1165, and then again the later one from about 80 1570 to 80 1720.
Right, the ones linked to the medieval climate anomaly and Little Ice Age.
Precisely. These gaps are often interpreted now as the direct result of intensified erosion and altered hydrology during naturally occurring dry climatic phases. These dry spells could have led to dramatic falls in the lake water levels, perhaps even the complete drying out of the shallow lake basin at times, which would cause sediment deposition to stop or even allow existing sediments to erode away.
So the gaps themselves could be climate signals, not just evidence of human destruction washing soil into the lake or something.
That's the key reinterpretation. The gaps might primarily indicate periods of significant drought, rather than necessarily indicating periods of peak human-caused erosion filling the lake up. The hiatus from approximately 8500 to 80 1165 in Lake Araku, for instance, aligns very well temporally with known drought phases that occurred during the medieval climate anomaly in other parts of the Pacific.
Okay.
Similarly, the later hiatus from around 80 1570 to 80 1720 could be directly related to drought events documented elsewhere during the Little Ice Age. It's also interesting to note that the Lake Araku Basin clearly flooded again, becoming a lake environment around 80 1200, right after that first long hiatus ended. This suggests a shift back to a higher precipitation to evaporation ratio, potentially matching a broader Pan-Pacific phase of rapid cooling and generally wetter conditions that seems to have occurred around 80 1300.
So the lake levels were responding directly to these larger climate patterns.
It strongly appears so. This demonstrates a natural, powerful climatic influence on the island's hydrological system and, consequently, its entire ecological state, independent of whatever the human population was doing at the time.
What about things like El Nino? Does that play a role on Easter Island? We hear so much about its impact elsewhere in the Pacific.
That's a good question. The influence of ENSO, the El Niño Southern Oscillation Cycle, on Easter Island's long-term climate variability is actually still quite unclear. Some studies propose a strong influence, suggesting El Niño might bring drier conditions and La Niña wetter ones, or vice versa, depending on the specific study. However, other analyses, often based on the relatively short instrumental records available from recent decades, deny a strong, consistent link.
So the jury's still out on El Nino's long-term impact there.
Pretty much. This area definitely requires further, more detailed paleo-environmental research, perhaps using different climate proxies from the lake cores or other sources, to fully understand how ENSO might have impacted Rapa Nui over the centuries of human occupation.
It's clear, though, that Rapa Nui wasn't just shaped by its inhabitants, but also by the powerful, often unseen hand of these natural climate patterns playing out over long periods. Drawing that parallel again, it really reminds me of the extensive paleo-environmental records, those scientific reconstructions of past environments. From other regions you mentioned, like the Lake Ohrid example. Those global records truly illustrate the long-term cyclical patterns of climate-driven vegetation change, providing that crucial broader context, right?
That's an excellent point to circle back to, yes. The Lake Ohrid pollen record, for instance, serves as that continuous, high-resolution archive spanning a staggering 500,000 years. It vividly illustrates the alternating glacial and interglacial periods. During glacial times, as we said, the region around Ohrid was dominated by grasslands and steppe environments. Then, during the warmer interglacial periods, you see vast woodland expansion.
Huge natural swings.
Huge natural swings driven by fundamental climate cycles like the Milankovitch cycles influencing Earth's orbit and tilt. This context is vital because it reminds us that significant vegetation changes, including widespread forest contraction and expansion, are a natural occurrence over long timescales. They are not exclusively anthropogenic or human-caused. They are also a fundamental part of Earth's natural history. And that provides a crucial lens through which to interpret the changes seen on Easter Island. We have to disentangle the human signal from the natural climate signal.
Right, context is everything. Micro recap.
So just to quickly recap this section, while human activity was undoubtedly present and definitely shaped the Rapa Nui landscape over time, climate has always been a powerful, independent force acting on the island. The evidence from sedimentary hiatuses in Lake Uraku, which seems strongly linked to major drought phases like the medieval climate anomaly and the Little Ice Age, clearly indicates that Rapa Nui experienced significant natural climatic shifts. These shifts profoundly impacted its environment, its water resources, and likely its vegetation patterns, independently of but also interacting with human actions.
It really reinforces that idea of a complex interplay of factors, not a simple cause and effect blame game focused solely on the islanders. Looking back at the evidence, you derive a much more nuanced picture.
Precisely. Nature had a very strong hand to play.
Okay, that deep dive into the climate's influence on Easter Island really adds another critical layer of complexity to the narrative, showing it wasn't just people acting in isolation. But now let's turn to a perhaps surprising yet arguably very significant player in Easter Island's deforestation story. The humble yet incredibly impactful Polynesian rat.
Ah, yes, Ratus excellens. This is where the story truly becomes even more nuanced and maybe lets the Rapa Nui people off the hook slightly, at least for the full extent of the palm forest's demise.
How so? What's the theory?
Well, the anthropologist Terry Hunt, along with his colleague Carl Lipo, have put forth a very compelling theory, backed by considerable evidence now, that the introduced Polynesian rats themselves may have caused significant deforestation on the island, particularly impacting the dominant palm species.
The rats ate the forest.
Essentially, yes, or prevented it from regenerating. Remember, the traditional ecocide view often blamed humans exclusively for felling millions of palm trees for various uses. However, a key ecological point is that the island's native palm trees, Pastilococos, evolved over millennia in an isolated environment that likely lacked significant seed predators. Their seeds weren't adapted to being eaten in large numbers.
Okay, vulnerable seeds.
Very vulnerable. Then, when Polynesian voyagers arrived, they brought the Polynesian rat with them, whether intentionally as a food source, which is possible, or just as accidental stowaways on their canoes, which is almost certain. These rats, finding an island with abundant food in the form of palm nuts and no natural predators, would have rapidly proliferated. Their populations likely exploded.
A rat plague, basically.
Quite possibly. And these rats then consumed vast quantities of the large, nutritious, and vulnerable palm seeds, or nuts. By eating the seeds, they severely hindered the forest's natural ability to regenerate. Even if mature trees died naturally or were cut down by humans, very few new seedlings would have been able to sprout and grow because the rats were eating all the seeds first.
Wow, so the rats were preventing new trees from growing.
Exactly. This crucial detail is supported by direct archaeological evidence. Those subfossil palm nuts we mentioned earlier, found preserved in caves and sediments on the island, frequently show evident signs of rat gnawing. You can literally see the teeth marks on these ancient nuts.
That's pretty damning evidence against the rats.
It is. This biological impact, the seed predation by rats, likely contributed significantly to the long-term decline of the palm forest, and it did so largely independently of direct human felling for timber or canoes. While humans undoubtedly played a role through land clearing for agriculture and using some wood resources, and maybe even burning areas which could have further suppressed regeneration.
Right, humans were still involved.
Of course. But the rats' widespread and continuous consumption of seeds suggests that deforestation, particularly of the palm resource, was likely a far more gradual, complex process. It wasn't necessarily an abrupt, island-wide collapse caused solely by human ecocide in just a few centuries. The Polynesian rat essentially acted as an unsung environmental engineer, albeit in this case a very destructive one from the perspective of the palm forest.
So this nuanced understanding of the rat's major role fundamentally challenges that simplistic tragedy of the commons narrative that has so often been applied to Easter Island, doesn't it? It has a huge non-human factor.
It absolutely does. The tragedy of the commons theory, where individuals acting purely in their own short-term self-interest inevitably deplete a shared resource, has been a powerful and convenient lens through which many have viewed Easter Island's fate. It fit the cautionary tale model. However, as we discussed with Elinor Ostrom's Nobel Prize-winning work, communities can and often do sustainably manage common pool resources through cooperation and effective rules. The Rapa Nui's development of sophisticated agricultural techniques like lithic mulch gardens and their apparent social organization for managing shared resources like the quarries suggests that their actions were likely far more complex and cooperative than simple self-interested exploitation leading inevitably to ruin.
They weren't necessarily acting purely selfishly.
The evidence for their complex social structure argues against that simple model. And the introduction of the Polynesian rat adds this significant, unforeseen external variable and invasive species with a massive ecological impact that dramatically complicates any narrative placing the blame solely on the human inhabitants. It challenges that powerful, often cited environmental cautionary tale, showing the profound importance of seeking out that grain of discovery beyond the popular headlines. We need to recognize the multifactorial nature of historical environmental change. It's rarely just one thing.
That's a profound shift in perspective, moving from a simplistic narrative blaming only the people to a much more multi-layered understanding involving climate, adaptation, social structure, and even rats.
It's a much richer story.
And it's all thanks, really, to the advances in the scientific methods being used. Let's now delve into those cutting-edge scientific advancements that allow researchers to reconstruct these past environments and timelines with such unprecedented precision, particularly focusing on those improved pollen dating methods you mentioned earlier. How exactly do they work?
Right. The ability to accurately date specific changes seen in environmental records, like sediment cores, is absolutely paramount to understanding the timing and sequence of past events. Did deforestation happen before or after a drought? When did a certain plant appear? Accurate dating is key.
Makes sense. You need a reliable clock.
Exactly. Traditionally, radiocarbon dating of lake sediment cores faced significant challenges. It often relied on finding relatively large pieces of terrestrial macrofossils, things like preserved twigs, leaves, or seeds washed into the lake, which are ideal for dating because they represent a specific moment in time and come directly from the land environment.
But those aren't always common.
They can be quite rare or even completely absent in some sediment layers. Plus, there was always the risk of contamination from other, older or younger, carbon-bearing materials present in the sediment, things like microscopic algae, bacteria, or even ancient reworked carbon from eroding rocks, which could skew the dates and make them unreliable.
Okay, so dating the mud itself was tricky.
Very tricky. However, a groundbreaking method, refined and detailed in a paper by Tunno and colleagues in 2021, directly addresses these challenges by allowing scientists to reliably date the pollen grains themselves. This method leverages accelerator mass spectrometry, AMS, radiocarbon measurement.
AMS dating. We hear about that a lot in archaeology.
Yes. AMS is a highly sensitive technique that allows for the precise dating of extremely small organic samples down to micrograms of carbon, literally the weight of a few hundred pollen grains, by accurately counting the atoms of different carbon isotopes, especially the rare radioactive carbon-14 isotope.
So you can date tiny things like pollen.
Precisely. But the innovative part of this improved method is its combination of an optimized pollen extraction protocol, which is carefully designed to avoid strong chemicals like hydrofluoric acid or carbon-based chemicals used in standard pollen prep, as these could introduce contamination or alter the carbon signature with flow cytometry sorting.
Flow cytometry. That sounds like something from a medical lab.
It is often used in biology and medicine, yes. It's a powerful technique traditionally used to rapidly analyze and separate different types of cells or microscopic particles suspended in a fluid stream as they pass through a laser beam. When applied to pollen extracts from sediments, it enables researchers to physically separate and purify the target pollen grains away from other contaminants, tiny bits of charcoal, fungal spores, algae, mineral fragments with remarkable precision and speed.
So it cleans up the pollen sample for dating.
Exactly. This purification process is absolutely key because it maximizes the amount of pure pollen carbon available for AMS dating while simultaneously minimizing the time and considerable expense required for the sorting process itself compared to, say, manually picking out pollen grains under a microscope, which would be incredibly laborious. It makes high-resolution pollen dating much more feasible and reliable.
It's like having an automated microscopic sorting machine.
That's a good way to think about it. Imagine having a system that can look at thousands of tiny particles per second, identify the pollen grains based on their size and fluorescence properties, and physically sort them into a clean sample vial for dating.
That's incredible precision.
Yeah.
How do they test it?
The researchers tested and refined this improved method using sediment samples from various lake environments in California, like Mono Lake and Fallen Leaf Lake, to demonstrate its reliability across different conditions. The pollen extraction protocol itself is meticulously designed. Its goal is to yield the largest possible amount of original pollen carbon for dating without chemically altering it or adding external carbon during processing. A primary aim is to eliminate most non-pollen organic and inorganic particles before the flow cytometry step, just to minimize the sorting time and cost.
So multiple cleaning steps.
Yes, key steps include careful sieving through very fine meshes and a heavy liquid separation, using dense, non-toxic solutions like sodium polytungstate to float the lighter pollen grains away from denser inorganic material like silt and clay. They are extremely careful about the chemicals used, avoiding anything that could compromise the radiocarbon date.
And does it work? Do the pollen dates match other methods?
Yes, that's the crucial validation. The paper presents results, for instance, from fallen leaf lake cores, shown in their Figure 6 and Table 3, where they compared the AMS dates obtained directly from sorted pollen concentrates with dates obtained from traditional terrestrial macrofossils found in the same core layers. The pollen dates aligned very well with the macrofossil dates, demonstrating the remarkable reliability and consistency of this new pollen dating method. It confirms that dating pollen directly can provide accurate chronologies, especially in sediments where macrofossils are scarce or absent.
That's a truly detailed explanation of the precision involved now. It really highlights that these incredibly detailed, almost forensic scientific methods are what allow researchers today to revisit these long-standing historical narratives, like the Easter Island collapse, with fresh, concrete, and much more accurately timed evidence.
Absolutely. It pushes the boundaries of what we thought was possible to reconstruct about past environments and human interactions with them.
It's like having an archaeological magnifying glass combined with a high-precision clock, allowing us to see back millennia with much greater clarity. We've covered such a vast landscape of new evidence today, stretching from deep geological timelines and surprising genetic breakthroughs about trans-Pacific contact, right down to these cutting-edge pollen dating techniques. It's been a real journey. Let's now return to our central theme, drawing together all this compelling evidence to present the powerful case for Rapa Nui resilience, really challenging that long-held collapse narrative head-on.
Absolutely. Let's bring it all together. I think the single most important takeaway from the recent decades of intensive interdisciplinary research is this. The prevailing view of a catastrophic population collapse on Easter Island due to ecocide, happening before European contact, is increasingly, and I would say robustly, refuted by the available archaeological, paleoecological, and genetic evidence.
So the story we all thought we knew was likely wrong.
The balance of evidence strongly points that way now. Instead, what the evidence consistently shows is a society that developed sophisticated social structures and sustainable practices. Things like Ahu construction and Moai carving appear to have been sustainable cultural traditions, deeply integrated into a resilient society that persisted for centuries, adapting to the resources available.
And a population crash came later.
Yes. Any significant population decline, and again, there definitely was a devastating decline, eventually appears to have been a tragic post-contact event. It was most likely primarily due to the catastrophic effects of Old World diseases like smallpox and tuberculosis, introduced by Europeans starting after 1722, to which the islanders had absolutely no immunity. In fact, as we mentioned, some newer scholarship using settlement pattern analysis suggests that the Rapa Nui population may have actually reached its peak, perhaps around 3,000 to 4,000 people, right around the very time Europeans first arrived in 1722.
Wow, so the opposite of the collapse narrative timeline.
Completely upending it. For you, the listener, this truly reframes the entire story you thought you knew about Easter Island. It wasn't a society that destroyed itself just before outsiders arrived. It was likely a thriving, adapted society tragically decimated after contact.
Okay, let's quickly summarize the key pieces of evidence that support this narrative of resilience rather than collapse.
Right. Firstly, the pollen and charcoal records. When analyzed with improved dating, they don't show an abrupt island-wide collapse and burn-off. Instead, they indicate a progressive, gradual replacement of the palm-dominated vegetation assemblages by grass-dominated ones over many centuries. While the charcoal increases clearly suggest human-induced burning and land clearing were part of this process, it looks like a slow transformation associated with agricultural development, not a sudden catastrophe. And the early presence of that weed, Verbena littoralis, also points to a gradual landscape change beginning much earlier, potentially associated with a lower impact initial human presence.
So slow change, not sudden crash in the vegetation record. What else?
Secondly, the sedimentary hiatuses in the lake course. Understanding these gaps is crucial. New, higher-resolution chronological frameworks reveal shorter, more defined gaps compared to the vast gaps inferred by earlier research. This provides a more continuous picture of ecological shifts overall. And crucially, these gaps, when they do occur, are now often convincingly linked to naturally occurring dry climatic phases, periods of drought causing lower lake levels and erosion, rather than being interpreted solely as evidence of catastrophic human destruction filling the lakes with eroded soil. Climate played a big role.
Okay, climate factors were significant. Third,
Thirdly, the role of the rats. This cannot be overstated. The introduction of Rattus excellens, the Polynesian rat, by the first settlers, is now understood as a major contributing factor, perhaps even the primary factor in hindering palm forest regeneration due to their intensive predation on the vulnerable palm seeds. This biological impact contributed substantially to the long-term decline of the palm forest, largely independent of human felling rates, adding a critical natural or semi-natural dimension to the deforestation narrative that complicates any simple story of human blame.
the rats were major players. And finally,
The evidence for agricultural adaptation and sustainable community practices stands out strongly. The Rapa Nui ingeniously developed and maintained those extensive lithic mulch gardens, which demonstrably improve soil productivity and moisture retention, allowing sustainable agriculture even on the island's relatively poor soils. This clearly demonstrates their capacity for innovation and adaptation rather than just resource depletion leading to starvation.
they found solutions.
They did. Moreover, the archaeological record, particularly the layout of settlements around Ahu and the evidence from the quarries, strongly suggests a society composed of semi-autonomous communities with effective, localized resource management. And there's evidence for larger-scale coordination for managing crucial common pool resources like the Moai quarries. This social structure appears consistent with Elinor Ostrom's principles of successful, sustainable self-governance for common resources. This organization allowed them to manage shared resources effectively for centuries without necessarily falling into a destructive tragedy of the commons.
So, putting it all together, the Rapa Nui story is not one of a simple tragedy of the commons, where unchecked self-interest inevitably leads to ruin. That narrative seems too simplistic now.
Far too simplistic. Instead, it's a far more complex and, I think, ultimately more interesting story. It's a nuanced interplay of long-term environmental factors like climate change and invasive species, combined with remarkable human ingenuity, adaptation, sophisticated social organization, and ultimately the devastating external influence of European contact and disease.
A completely different picture emerges.
Completely. The ecocide narrative is increasingly viewed by specialists as perhaps a modern myth, or even carrying elements of a colonial narrative, one that, unfortunately, maybe unintentionally, misrepresented the Rapa Nui people's actual resilience and their sustainable practices by focusing only on the negative aspects and overlooking their successes. The truth seems to be that there is so much we can learn from their ability to adapt and survive for centuries in what was always a challenging, resource-limited, and isolated environment.
If we connect this to the bigger picture.
The Rapa Nui story offers potentially valuable lessons about human capacity for long-term survival and sustainable living, even in the face of significant environmental change. It actively challenges preconceived notions, often rooted in colonial biases, about the intelligence, foresight, and adaptive capabilities of ancient non-Western peoples. They were not simply a cautionary tale of failure, they were, for a very long time, masters of adaptation.
Okay, before we wrap up, let's quickly run through some of the key terms we've used throughout this deep dive. Think of it as a rapid-fire flashcard section to help solidify your understanding of the Rapa Nui puzzle. Ready? Ready? Let's try it. First up, accelerator mass spectrometry, AMS radiocarbon measurement.
Right. That's the highly sensitive method used for precise dating of very small organic samples like those tiny pollen grains we talked about by directly counting the atoms of carbon isotopes, especially carbon-14. It allows for much more accurate chronologies.
Phase depth model.
That's the chronological framework scientists build for sediment cores. It essentially estimates the age of the sediment at different depths, usually based on multiple radiometric dates like AMS dates, allowing them to reconstruct the timing of past environmental changes. The large stone ceremonial platforms on Rapa Nui where the Moai statues were erected, they were central to Rapa Nui society, representing ancestral veneration, community identity, and social organization.
Anthropogenic.
A key term. It simply means caused or influenced by human activities. Distinguishing between anthropogenic changes and natural changes is central to the whole ecocide debate.
Ecocide.
The destruction of the natural environment, often attributed in the traditional Rapa Nui narrative to willful or short-sighted human acts leading to ecological and societal collapse. It's the narrative that's now being strongly debated and revised.
Flow cytometry sorting.
That modern technique, borrowed from biology, used to physically separate and purify pollen concentrates from other microscopic debris in sediment samples. This allows for much cleaner samples and therefore more accurate AMS radiocarbon dating of the pollen itself.
Fossil pollen, or palynology.
Pollen grains preserved in sediments like lake mud or peat bogs. The study of this fossil pollen, palynology, provides a continuous record of past vegetation changes, which in turn tells us about past climate, human impact on the landscape. That's the current geological epoch we live in. It began about 11,700 years ago, after the last major glacial period, the Pleistocene Ice Age, and encompasses the entire period of Rapa Nui settlement.
Lithic mulch gardens.
Those sophisticated agricultural adaptations developed by the Rapa Nui. They used stone mulching, placing rocks around crops to improve soil productivity, conserve moisture, and protect plants, demonstrating resilience and ingenuity. The large, iconic, monolithic human figures carved by the Rapa Nui people from volcanic tuff. They are profound cultural artifacts whose purpose, transport, and connection to the environment are central to the island's history and the debates surrounding it.
Multi-proxy study.
This refers to a scientific investigation that uses multiple types or proxies of environmental or archaeological data, for example, analyzing pollen, diatoms, algae, charcoal, geochemistry, and archaeological remains, all from the same site or region. Combining multiple lines of evidence gives a much more robust and comprehensive understanding of past conditions.
Paleo-environmental reconstructions.
That's the whole process of inferring past environmental conditions like climate, vegetation, lake levels from geological or biological evidence preserved in natural archives like sediment cores, ice cores, or tree rings.
Palynological studies. We mentioned this, but good to reinforce.
Yes, the scientific studies specifically focusing on fossil pollen and spores to reconstruct past vegetation dynamics, infer climate change, and identify human impact on ecosystems.
Polynesian rat. Rattus excellens.
The small rat species introduced, likely accidentally, by Polynesian voyagers across the Pacific. On Rapa Nui, it's now identified as a significant factor in the decline of the native palm forest due to its intensive predation on the palm seeds, complicating the human-only deforestation narrative.
Pukau.
The large cylindrical red scoria hats or top knots that were placed on top of some of the later moai statues on the Ahu, they likely symbolize status, power, or perhaps represented hairstyles. They were quarried at Punapau.
Sedimentary hiatus.
A gap in the geological record within a sedimentary sequence, like a lake core. It indicates a period when sediments were not being deposited, or when existing sediments were eroded away. On Rapa Nui, these are often linked to climatic changes, particularly droughts.
Sustainability.
A core concept today, but relevant here too. It's the ability to maintain something like a society, an ecosystem, or a practice at a certain rate or level indefinitely, meeting present needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. The debate centers on whether Rapa Nui society was sustainable before European contact.
Traditional ecological knowledge. Tech.
That cumulative body of knowledge, practices, beliefs, and wisdom about the environment evolved through adaptive processes and handed down through generations, often orally, within indigenous or local communities. Examples include the Rahui system in French Polynesia or the detailed Samoan weather forecasting based on natural signs.
Tragedy of the commons.
An economic theory describing a situation where multiple individuals acting independently in their own rational self-interest ultimately deplete a shared, limited resource, even when it's clear that doing so is not in anyone's long-term interest. This was often applied to Rapa Nui, but Ostrom's work and the new evidence challenged this simple application.
And finally, Verbena littoralis.
That specific weed, known to be of American origin, its presence in very early layers of Easter Island sediments around 450 BC is intriguing evidence suggesting early human disturbance of the landscape and potentially hinting at very early pre-Columbian contact or connections between Polynesia and the Americas.
Excellent. Hopefully that helps keep some of these key concepts clear. Hashtag outro. And that brings our deep dive into Rapa Nui to a close. What a journey it's been, really digging into the details.
It certainly has. A lot to reconsider.
The story of Easter Island, it turns out, is far richer, much more complex, and ultimately perhaps more hopeful and definitely more about resilience than the simple cautionary tale of ecocide and collapse we've often been told. It's really a profound testament to human adaptability, to ingenious solutions developed in the face of significant environmental change, and also to the ongoing meticulous work of science, using all these different proxies and dating techniques to uncover a more accurate picture of the past. So what does this all mean for us today?
Well, it leaves us with a really important question to reflect on, I think. Given this compelling evidence of Rapa Nui resilience, their remarkable ability to adapt to severe environmental changes over centuries, including deforestation partly driven by rats, and significant natural climatic shifts like droughts, what can modern societies truly learn from their experience?
Learn from their success, not just their supposed failure.
Exactly. What can we learn about facing our own global environmental challenges? About distinguishing between the problems we create ourselves and the impacts of natural variability that we also have to adapt to. And maybe most importantly, what can we learn about fostering genuine, long-term sustainability and community-based resource management, drawing perhaps on principles similar to those they seem to have employed? This revised Rapa Nui story raises an important question. Maybe the answers aren't always about top-down control, but about community-level adaptation and cooperation.
Absolutely. A much more thought-provoking legacy. And with that question lingering, we encourage you, our listeners, to continue exploring this fascinating history on your own. Perhaps you'll delve into more of the multi-proxy paleoecological studies, or maybe explore the detailed work on traditional ecological knowledge from other incredible Pacific islands like Fiji or Samoa that we touched upon.
There's always more to learn.
There certainly is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the complex and resilient story of Rapa Nui. We look forward to exploring another complex topic with you next time.